So good morning, my name is Anna Baglione, and I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about how people use grief in the online world. And so I'm working with Doctors Shih and James Clawson, who are both in the audience today, or will be. I'm sure Patrick's going to come. And the two people as our second and third authors are our awesome undergrads from this summer. So I will provide a content warning. Obviously, this session is a bit heavier than others, so for any reason you need to step out of the room, please feel free. I'm happy to speak to you about any of this at a later time if you feel more comfortable outside the session. So with that, we'll get started with a pretty simple question. We're going to ask, or I'm going to ask you rather, what is grief? What do you think about when you hear the word grief? The professional definition of grief is the primary emotional or affective response to the loss of a loved one through death. And this may be the death of a number of different people, whether it be a spouse, a child, a partner. And it can also, in modern terms, signify perhaps a loss that we consider not lesser, certainly, but a different kind that is not death. So the loss of a relationship, a home, some kind of resource. And so in the United States, where I live, millions of people experience grief every single year. And this is based on US vital statistics reports for death rates. And while people certainly have different reactions through grief to death, we really want to emphasize that grief is something that is indiscriminate. It affects people of all different backgrounds, regardless of age, gender, religion, race, or socioeconomic status. So in this talk, I'm going to focus today with you on what we call complicated grief. And for those of you who may be sitting there thinking, what is complicated grief? I'm going to explain. Complicated grief is what we consider debilitating. So it extends past the first 6 months after the death. And in more modern terms, again, it is known as prolonged grief disorder. This was a term coined by Prigerson et al., and it has been used in the extent of the literature since approximately 2010. So for all purposes for this talk, it is complicated grief, just to keep things simple. Complicated grief is marked by things that you would normally see perhaps in somebody with depression, but it's exemplified because of this death. So we see these intrusive thoughts, painful yearning, extreme sense of denial, and ultimately a large portion that is loneliness. And so you can imagine if you're going through complicated grief, you may feel very isolated, which is what we're going to talk about a bit later. Really briefly, I'm going to highlight some of the previous work that's been done both on grief in general, or rather on grief in general in and outside of HCI. Who is familiar with Kubler-Ross's stages? Is anybody in here? Okay, so quite a bit of you. So we know that these are the 5 stages of grief that we typically think about throughout the historical literature. So we have this denial almost immediately after the death where the person may not acknowledge that this death has happened or that what is happening is actually real. We then move into anger, bargaining, trying to come to terms with what has happened, almost negotiating trade-offs in your head. We move into this depressive phase and finally acceptance. But as any of us know who have gone through grief or complicated grief, this acceptance phase is rather elusive. And this is why we have this paper in the first place. But staying focused in HCI for a minute, we see that there are 2 paths that have been traditionally taken for the grief literature. We see that the 4 authors that I have listed on the left have focused extensively on digital memorialization practices, so how you remember your loved one online. And we note that a lot of these studies have relied on websites like Facebook, for example. And the same goes for the use of online platforms and tools for grief. So especially Brubacher et al.'s work is pretty prominent in this space. I'd encourage you to look up any of these authors if you're interested and to read our paper. So the question that we pose today is, while most of the literature has looked at what we would consider normal grief, we haven't necessarily looked at how complicated grievers deal with their feelings and emotions long-term in a technology-centric age, which is what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to highlight our study methodology in which we took a survey and interview approach, and we used a mixed methods approach to this. So first, we approached the administrators of online grief groups. Again, we primarily recruited through Facebook, but we also looked at forum websites like Grief in Common and Beyond Indigo. And again, I don't know if anybody's familiar with those, but these are kind of the popular online spaces that individuals gravitate towards when they are experiencing grief and want a support community outside the in-person setting. And so once we received approval from these admins, we then felt comfortable distributing the survey link to the individuals, either by quickly jumping into the group, putting the link there and leaving, or allowing the admins to complete that process for us. And this approach has been emphasized in several other studies by my colleagues, and both in and out of my lab. We approach studies like this way because it is very respectful of vulnerable communities. So I would encourage you to keep that in mind as you are conducting your own studies if you do take this kind of approach. So what we used is a survey and interview study, as I said. And what makes our study unique is that we actually use some of the validated instruments that you see in clinical literature. So we have the Texas Revised Inventory of Grief, which again is quite an old instrument that has been used to measure normal grief. We see the Inventory of Complicated Grief, which is, again, what we're focusing on here. And finally, we move on to the Coping Strategies questionnaire. So all of these were included in our survey, along with open-ended questions. The key to our study is that we augmented the Coping Strategies questionnaire with technology-centric questions. So for example, I'm a big musicophile, and this is just one example. We may have asked the individuals, I use digital music or create it to cope with my loss. And so those are the kinds of technology-centric questions that we asked. And we also combined this survey with an interview, as I said. So in total, we had a pretty good response rate for the surveys. I would encourage you to read the paper to see how those response rates somewhat dropped off because this was such a heavy survey. But in total, we had 99 people respond and 11 interviewees. Interestingly enough, all of whom were women. And there's plenty of literature out there about grieving, both within and beyond gender, and I would encourage you to look up that if you have time. But all of our interviewees were women, and 9 of them, interestingly enough, were survivors of suicide loss. So keep that in mind as we progress. So I'm going to highlight our findings first by looking at the principal component analysis results. So this is the quantitative part of the mixed methods. So we see 2 really interesting things, and I apologize this table isn't of better quality. So we see, interestingly enough, that almost nobody has faith in their doctor, which I've seen this in several sessions, and it's a little bit concerning. Perhaps an open conversation with clinicians needs to be had. And we also see, perhaps on a more positive note, that digital photos are a very important remembrance tool, and this has been echoed in a lot of the HCI literature. But you may be asking, okay, what's new about this study? We are here today to present a new model for complicated grief in the digital age. And you may be sitting there wondering, why do we need a new model? I think the best way to convince you of that is to walk you through step by step what this model entails and to supplement it with quotes from our participants, which is what I'm going to do now. So first we have this period of fog, as you can see up here. And fog is marked as the beginning of the journey, typically marked by task handling, whether it's for paperwork or details about the funeral. This was found by Munker et al., who also focus on digital memorials. And so with this fog period, we see this mix of emotions that are not being processed and that perhaps are being put off until a later time. We see confusion, frustration, sadness, and anger, but it's all just kind of sitting there waiting to be processed. And then we see what comes as isolation, perhaps when people stop bringing meals by, the funeral is over, it's been a few weeks, and people are just kind of letting you, put yourself in the shoes of a complicated griever. People are trying to allow you to process, but sadly, you feel isolated, and you start to withdraw and feel lonely. And so what we see then, as supplemented by participant 86, is that there is this profound sense of just being completely alone in this world of grief. So she said here, I can't count the number of times I was told by somebody that I thought would understand, you should be over this by now. And I will note that for this participant in particular, this was within 1 to 2 years of the loss. So a very short time period if we consider the long-term implications of grief in the grief journey. So what we see then as a high-level theme is that others don't often understand when you are going through complicated grief. And this then sets participants up for an exploration phase where they know they're not getting adequate support according to their needs, and so they start to branch out and see what resources are available to them. So we see them seeking out both formal and informal support resources, whether they be reading materials or support groups, both on and offline. And so Participant 41 had a good example of this. She said, I didn't want to leave my house. I was totally and completely isolated. But then I found this group, which for her was survivors of suicide loss, if I recall correctly. And she said, there are other people that have gone through this, they've survived this. How is that even possible? So there's this sense of incredulity that comes with this exploration phase, that other people are in fact going through what you are going through. So we see then that support groups can indeed be an escape from isolation. And this is an important theme throughout the rest of our paper and our presentation. We then move into the immersion phase. So in this phase, we see investing in new support structures through regular meetings if you're in person, or posting and commenting frequently if you are online. And this participant, I remember, was a little bit closer in age to me, and so she was pretty well connected with the Facebook community that she was in. And she was describing to me after the loss of her partner, I personally like online better because you can go at your own pace. You can scroll past things when you need to. Whereas with the in-person group, there is absolutely no way I am getting out of it without crying my eyes out. And so we see then that these online groups in particular can be safe spaces, but there is a caveat to this, which is what we're highlighting now. They may also, in some way, cause isolation to worsen. And so for those of us who are familiar with social media, I'm going to go off the cuff for a bit, we know that there is this kind of loop that we may get into where we are so sucked in by the notifications that we are getting and the friends that we have made, both on and offline, and that environment is very real to us. But sometimes we don't leave it when we need to experience healthy social interactions. And so perhaps this is a deeper conversation about when online versus offline interactions may be, in fact, healthy. So we see in particular this phenomenon with our complicated grievers. So as participant 25 said, it was helpful at first, but as the numbness began to lessen, I withdrew more, which is quite ironic, because if I found it overwhelming to learn of a new suicide on almost a daily basis. So we see this complete inundation with really negative information, which may in fact have prevented this participant from experiencing healthy grief and from moving forward, never moving on, we emphasize. And so what we see then is there's a risk here for a loop that we get caught in if we are a complicated griever, if we're in their shoes. And if we can't break out of this loop of isolation, exploration, immersion, and then looping back in, there may obviously be negative health outcomes. And this is the part where we kind of need more research. But I highlight in particular that there is this interesting threshold point. And we don't know when this manifests for online versus offline grievers. There's still not enough information. But we know that this may in fact be present, where if we can get them over the line, we may in fact help them reach a stabilization period. Kind of similar to Kubler-Ross's acceptance, but a little more open-ended, which I forgot to highlight. We emphasize that for the remainder of our model with the dashed lines. It's meant to convey fluidity of phases, so these can occur in tandem, and you may cycle back through these multiple times. It's very, very fluid. And so, but with the stabilization phase, we see resilience and equilibrium and a full ownership of an identity as a grieving individual, and as a complicated griever in particular. So what does this mean then for the HCI community? We've presented this new model. How are we going to implement it? I have 4 main implications for design that I'd like to present to you, and then I'd open the floor to questions and for a deeper discussion. So first, we need to make both in-person and online support groups more accessible, each in different ways. So for online groups, this may mean partnering with funeral homes to provide a database of online resources, for example, and to do that early and often, and to be checking in with people, while also emphasizing agency, which brings me to my next point. Agency is critical in this area. We need to help individuals find the best path forward for their unique needs in their grief journey. This is going to be different for every single person, and we heard that over and over again from our participants. Third, we need to reduce this information overload in online groups. Notice that I am not saying or advocating that we abandon them completely, but rather that we find ways to make them more conducive to coming in, experiencing healthy grieving online, and also perhaps partnering that with offline support. So we see this marriage of the 2 types of support when appropriate. And this may differ by phase, and this may change over and over again. And finally, perhaps on a lighter note, we need to see how these tools for expressing grief through digital photographs can be utilized in a sharing-oriented format that is perhaps not what we have now. Right now we have albums, and those may be perceived as flat. It may be uncomfortable to share these with family and friends, and we need to figure out a way to foster conversations within a grieving individual's support community through photographs. This has been shown, again, historically, to be the strongest point we have for designers at the moment. So with that, I thank you, and I open the floor to questions.
Please state your name and affiliation when you come and ask our speakers questions.
Hi, my name's Katie. I'm from the University of Washington. Thanks for your great talk. Just wondered if you noticed any strategies that people use to handle the inundation of information in the online community?
Sure. That's something, unfortunately, we didn't see. We heard a lot of people talking about it, and the only thing we saw was that, like, oh, I withdrew. I will say, again, kind of off the cuff, that I noticed that my participants who did seem to progress to healthy grief ended up, I don't know how, but found the motivation to get to an in-person support forum, and it was typically one-on-one therapy. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So did they find peers that they liked in the online community to go off sort of to the side?
Yes, actually that was a frequent practice. We saw people making friends from across the country, and they'd find ways to meet up or email or coffee chat over the phone. That was a big positive of this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jordan Pollock from Carleton. I was wondering if you could expand more on use of digital photographs in grief and some of the problems specifically you've seen, and maybe any untested ideas that you have to move forward with that.
Sure. We played around with, so my undergraduates, that I wish I could go back to the beginning, maybe I can. My undergraduates actually prototyped an application, so they're the second and third author, and they were wonderful, and we considered making it more photo-centric. I haven't seen, and people didn't talk much about how they used photographs in terms of like positives or negatives. They did say they did a lot of Facebook sharing, and they shared on important anniversaries, so the death anniversary, birthdays, events that they remembered. So the On This Day feature was really important to them. So maybe a reminiscence tool like that would be an option to create. Yeah.
Do you have any insights on reminiscence? Because I've heard just from anecdotal things that the reminiscence is actually very can be very harmful to relive.
Sure.
To get that unexpectedly.
Sure.
At least.
Yes. You know what? You're right. This is kind of the part that's open to exploration.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have a good answer. I wish I did.
worries.
But yeah.
But thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Ferguson from the McGill School of Information.
Hi.
I had a question about if you have any insight how people within the informal network, so family and friends, could support the grieving person if they're not necessarily grieving themselves.
Sure.
And I ask because of your quote that people felt they heard they should be over it, so they turned to online as a result.
Yeah, honestly, the Western world needs education about how to talk about grief. Even I've gone through it, and I'm seeing somebody else go through it, and I'm still very uncomfortable. I think we need to do some reading ourselves and educate ourselves on best ways to approach people. And it's definitely not saying, you should get over this.